All right. Questions for this chapter. I've only got two because every time I came up with another one, then I thought it was a little too tricky. So we've just got two pre-chapter questions today, right? And all right, so the first question is, other than gas exchange, which is occurring at the alveoli, name two of the three processes or jobs that the other structures of the respiratory system have to do. Right? So other than gas exchange, what are two of the three other jobs that the structures of the respiratory system do? Other than gas exchange, name two of the three jobs or processes the other structures of the respiratory system do. Question number two, a difference in what causes air to move in and out of the lungs? Difference in what causes air to move in and out of the lungs? Okay. All right, so trade off. Make sure you got your name on it. Okay, question one is humidifying, warming, or filtering. So two of those three, half a point each. Right. Question number two is pressure. Difference in pressure causes air to move in and out of the lungs. Right. So how many out of two? There, and I'll collect those up. Okay. So, chapter 7 then, and we're looking at the respiratory system. Okay. I have a feeling on the syllabus I only have this down for 2 lectures, and I think that's going to kick me in the butt. I have a feeling I might need 3, but we'll give it a go. See how far we can get today. Right. So, structures in the respiratory system, if you're looking at the whole system, that includes the nose and the nasal cavity. Right? Pharynx and larynx. Trachea, and then the bronchi and the bronchioles and the alveoli. We're going to be mostly talking about things that are going on at the level of the alveoli. Okay, so way down deep in the lung tissue. All right, and if you notice on this diagram, they indicate that there's a capillary network wrapped around each of those alveoli. Okay, that plays a big role, so that's very key. What's going on here and their structure, the fact that they're little round sacs. So respiratory system is to exchange gas between the air and the blood, all right, in both directions. So we have a mechanism to conduct air in and out of the lungs, and we can transfer oxygen out of the lungs into the bloodstream and carbon dioxide from the bloodstream into the lungs and breathe that out. Right? So the gas exchange doesn't occur until we get to the level of the alveoli. Right? The structures before the alveoli are responsible for humidifying the air, because the alveoli, the membranes in the alveoli are very delicate, and we don't want them to dry out and tear or break. And we want to make sure that we can keep them moist. So by breathing through our nose and it passing down our trachea, it picks up water along the way, and that humidifies the air. Right? And that's really important when you're in a cold environment, because cold air tends to be drier, doesn't hold as much water vapor. Or if you're in a very low humidity, so right slap bang where we are, right? We get all of that occurring if it's, we get low humidity, and then in the winter we also get cold. So we get a double whammy. Another job is warming the air. So we want to maintain the body temperature of the lungs and keep the temperature warm at the level of the membrane where the gas exchange is going on, so that we've got good blood flow there and we're able to move these gases in and out. And then filtering the air, mucus is produced, and that mucus traps airborne particles. That's particularly important if we are living in a polluted environment. So if you're in the middle of a city, or if you are living by a cotton field or somewhere where they're spraying, right? The cilia inside the lungs moves mucus up towards the mouth to get expelled. So some of it evaporates, some of it we swallow, some of it comes up to our nose and we blow our nose. Okay? And any particles that get missed by the mucus hopefully are engulfed by macrophages, which are one of the immune-fighting immune cells. Right? If it doesn't get eaten by a macrophage, that's when we're looking at getting sick. Right? So, I mean, we don't always, it's not a fail-proof mechanism. Occasionally we get sick. Right? Okay. Ooh, wrong way. All right, so those alveoli then, hopefully this is review and you covered this in A&P. So think back to that other picture, they're little round sacs. The lungs look like one thing, but when you slice through lung tissue, it's got lots of little circles, sort of bubbles in it almost, right? They're attached to the end of the respiratory bronchioles, and the alveoli is the site for the gas exchange, right? They're very delicate, they're very thin, and it's relatively easy at that point to move oxygen and carbon dioxide backwards and forwards. On average, people have around 300 million alveoli in their lungs. The bigger the person, the bigger the lungs, the more alveoli there are. Can be up to 700 million, I think, somewhere around there. But average around 300 million, so there's a lot of them to keep healthy. And they're key because they're round. That provides a much greater surface area than it would if the lung was just one piece of flat tissue. Right? The round surface, it's a bit like if you look at the brain. The reason we've got all those folds in the brain is that that provides a greater surface area. It's a similar situation here in the lungs, right? If we spread lungs out, if we spread the alveoli out flat, they would cover a tennis court. So there's a lot of surface area caught up in all those little tiny round sacs, okay? And what we're looking at is what we call the respiratory membrane. So we've got the membrane of the alveolus, and it lies almost touching the membrane of the capillary wall. There's a very, very small, minute space between the two, the respiratory membrane. So here's the capillary wall, here's the alveolar wall, and here's the space. All right? So here's my alveolus, just one. If I take a cross-section through, that gives you an idea of the fact that it's absolutely surrounded by this webbing of capillaries. Okay. So what we're looking at, we want oxygen to move out of the lungs and into the bloodstream, sit on our red blood cell, remember? Okay, the hemoglobin in the red blood cell is going to pick up the oxygen. And we want to drop off carbon dioxide, move it into the lungs so we can breathe it out. Question. All right. You don't really need to understand, like the pleural sac isn't something we talk about in ex-phys, although it does provide the possibility to create pressure in the lungs. Okay, so all I'm going to say right here is the pleural sac, so the outside of the lung has a membrane on it, and the inside of the thoracic cavity has a membrane. And they kind of stick together, so your lungs are almost glued to the inside of your rib cage and your thorax. That means that allows us to breathe because lung tissue can't contract. It's not like heart muscle or skeletal muscle. It can't contract, so the lungs don't contract and relax to move air in and out. We move the lungs by moving everything else. And because the lungs are stuck to the inside of the thorax, they move as well. All right? So that's really the only thing you need to understand about that bit. Because, right, it allows us to change the pressure within the lungs. Right? And so one of the things we missed out on when I couldn't finish the lecture earlier in the week was a concept, physics concept about pressure and movement of fluids and movement of gases, right? Fluids and gases, actually everything really, but all systems. But when you look at fluids and gases, they move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Always. So if I have a river the only way the river flows is if there's higher pressure at the mouth of the river and it's flowing towards an area of lower pressure, i.e. a lake or the sea. All right? Exactly the same thing happens in our bodies. So when you're looking at the cardiovascular chapter, one of the things that I did do with you was blood flow. Blood flows from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure in the system, otherwise it wouldn't flow. Okay? The same thing is going to occur here when we're looking at breathing. Alright?
Does that go in a sense with like your arm falling asleep or your leg falling asleep? In a way, if you cut off?
When your arm or your leg falls asleep, that gives you the opportunity to almost feel this happening, because you pinch the nerve or you pinch the blood vessel and you stop the blood flow, and then when you move it, you can almost feel the blood flow going down. Yeah. All right, so if we follow this rule then what we're looking for is the pressure inside the lungs has to be higher than the pressure outside of the lungs for me to breathe out, for me to move air from in to out. It's going to go from high to low. So the intrathoracic pressure has to be higher than the atmospheric pressure. So, and vice versa. So if I can increase the volume of the intrathoracic cavity and increase lung volume, that decreases the pressure. So we do that using our muscles that are used for inspiration, for breathing. So the most important muscle that works is the diaphragm. Okay, that flat, if you remember your anatomy, you have that big, thick, flat muscle that kind of sits at the bottom of our rib cage above our stomach. That's the most important muscle when we're looking at breathing. It flattens as it contracts, and it pulls the bottom of your ribs down, and therefore the bottom of your lungs down, and it expands your lungs, increases the volume. If I increase the volume, that drops the pressure within that space. Because now I've got the same amount of gas, but in a bigger area. So pressure drops. Because the pressure drops, that lowers the pressure below the outside pressure, and air can move in to the lungs. I breathe in. If I want to breathe out, I've got to reverse the process. I've got to decrease the lung volume, increase the pressure, and have the pressure higher inside than outside, and the air can move out. Right? So, if I'm looking here, whenever you're doing these pressure change things, and we'll come back to it again when we're looking at movement of oxygen in and out of the muscle tissue. This is not directional from a tissue to a tissue. This is directional from a pressure to a pressure. So, if I'm breathing in, this is the atmosphere, and this is my lungs. Right? Air moves from high to low. So if I'm going, in order to do that, this had to be high and this had to be low for air to move in. Right? If I'm breathing out, though, this has to reverse. Right? If I want that air to move back out, this has to be the high pressure and that has to be the low pressure. Okay? Because that sometimes, it's a simple concept, but it gets a bit fuzzy sometimes when you start moving these around. Right, so now to breathe out, we don't have muscles that pull the lungs back or pull the rib cage back the other way. All right, I don't use any muscular effort most of the time in order to breathe out. You just switch off the diaphragm and the other muscles that were contracting, and everything relaxes back. We can, when we're exercising, actually force our air out if we have to. But when you're at rest, you're not aware of contracting muscles to move air in and out. Right? At rest, most of your breathing is controlled involuntarily. Right? Your central nervous system just, you're not thinking about breathing in, you're not thinking about breathing out. It's controlled involuntarily. But we can hold our breath. I can override the central nervous system for a period of time, not for very long, right? Which is why people drown, because you can't hold your breath for very long. Brain won't let you. So, right? So these pressure gradients then, high to low, are created by changing the volume, by contracting the respiratory muscles to move the rib cage and expand and add volume and decrease pressure, and then relax and let everything go back and increase the pressure and the air comes out. This is not the right version of this. This is not the right version of this. All right, that diagram is on page 183 in your book. So just trying to put that concept into picture form for you. Okay, so airflow resistance, and when you are looking at these, this is very, very similar material. The concept here is very similar to the information under blood flow in the previous chapter. Okay, airflow is a change in pressure within an area over the resistance that is provided to the air. Okay? So airflow, how much air can move, depends upon pressure difference, change in pressure over resistance between those two areas. So if I want to increase airflow, then I can increase the pressure difference between the two areas, right? Or I can decrease I can decrease the resistance to the airflow. We do that by increasing the diameter of the airways and the diameter of the lung tissue and the, right? I can, and so the diameter of the airway is the biggest factor affecting airflow. That means then that if you have a chest infection, or if you're asthmatic, right, or if you've got bronchitis, or any of those kind of respiratory issues, what that does is decrease airflow because the passages get full of all this additional mucus, and and/or the muscles are tired and fatigued, and so that doesn't happen very often typically, but when you're sick it can happen. Okay, so we decrease the diameter of the airway, and that makes it harder to get air into the system. The other thing we see is that the mouth is bigger than the nose. So when we exercise, if you do aerobic exercise for a long time, try to pay attention to it the next time you do an aerobic workout, because it's not a conscious switch. You might start your workout breathing through your nose, right? Especially if you're outside and you have allergies, and there's goodness knows what only pollen. Chinese elms are blooming at the moment, and everything's a disaster. Right? So particularly if you're exercising outside and you know that you need to breathe through your nose to try to reduce pollen and help your allergies. Pay attention to the fact that at some point in your aerobic workout, you'll suddenly find yourself breathing through your mouth, even though you knew you should breathe through it, because your brain switches over, because it can get more air by making you breathe through your mouth than it can when you're breathing through your nose. It's a bit contradictory to me. It's one of the few things, it seems to me, when I look at this material, one of the few things that doesn't seem, it's efficient from an exercise point of view, but it's not efficient from a health standpoint necessarily, right? It gets more oxygen in, but it also allows more pollutants, irritants into the system. So when we're exercising, bronchodilation, so the sympathetic nervous system, our sympathetic increases heart rate, decreases digestion, does all those things to get us more efficient for exercising. One of the things it does is dilate the bronchioles as wide as possible, so I've got as much airflow as possible coming into the lungs. Okay. There is a note in this chapter about those nasal strips, those things that you see people put across their nose. And according to the research that the book is reporting, there's no physiological advantage to wearing those strips. So their argument is that it's a placebo, so people think it's helping and therefore they feel better. But physiologically, they haven't shown that they actually make any difference whatsoever. So, just in case.
They help me. Yeah, not mentally.
That's false.
Yes.
And I always wonder, does that mean they don't help? Because they often suggest those for people who snore.
Yeah.
They help me.
They help you?
Not mentally either. Like, it clears me up. So,
Yeah. So,
Yeah, but you've got allergies,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So they maybe change the shape enough for, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just reporting the research, guys.
prove it. What's your source?
It does seem odd to me because a lot of people say they help, but I haven't actually read the piece of research that they're reporting, so I don't know what they did to look at that.
Wow.
All right, so pulmonary ventilation then is the fancy term for breathing. How much air am I moving in and out of the lungs in any given time period? Usually it's, when we're looking, it's per minute. Yes, sir?
Sorry. What causes snoring? If it's a dumb question, we
If I knew the answer and I could put that right, that would be very nice. Snoring. I snore terribly. I think my personal experience is when my allergies are really bad, I snore. So I think it's a decreased airflow. But for some people, if they've got a deviated septum, the little bone in the nose, then I've heard that causes snoring. I would suspect if you've broken your nose a few times, that probably doesn't help. But
So you're either born with it or you're not, kind of?
well, I don't ever remember being told when I was a child that I snore. But my partner complains about it all the time. So apparently I wasn't born with it, but I didn't have allergies when I lived in England either. So, and now I have pretty bad allergies living in England. So.
Thank you.
All right, so air moved in and out of the lungs in a given time per minute, pulmonary ventilation. So that's kind of like Q when we look at cardiac numbers, right? Cardiac output and pulmonary ventilation are similar concept. How much blood or how much air are moved per minute, right? Tidal volume then is the amount of air moved per breath, is similar to stroke volume, how much blood is moved per beat. And so we have basically the same calculation, right? Pulmonary ventilation, amount of air expired per minute is tidal volume times frequency. Q is SV times HR, right? It's the same exact calculation with the different terms put in it. And not surprisingly, you'll be happy to know that pulmonary ventilation is larger, greater in trained athletes. So they're able to move more air per minute. So if you look at table 7.1 on page 186, you can see that it's quite a dramatic difference. All right, a sedentary or a low-trained individual moves around 8 liters per minute when they're sitting at rest. And if they can exercise hard enough, then someone who's not really well trained can get to up to about 113 liters per minute for moderate to high intensity. When you look at endurance athletes, they can get up to 183 liters per minute. So that's 70 liters per minute more air they can move in and out of their lungs. So then think about what does that mean then? If I've got 70 liters per minute more air, imagine how much more oxygen I have access to. Right? So not only do they have a different muscle fiber type that makes them better at running, but the more they run, the more they train, the more adaptations you see that make them even better. So the gap gets bigger and bigger between a regular person and someone who's really trained. Right? We can determine these lung capacities and lung volumes using the spirometry equipment. we've been trying to set up an appointment with Dr. Barlow so that maybe we could go over and have a look at that in his lab, but we've not been having too much success at that so far, but we'll keep trying, all right? So there's always a little bit of air left in the lungs in between breaths called the residual volume that allows gas exchange. Otherwise, there'd be no gas, like in between breathing, no gas would be moving backwards and forwards, which doesn't happen. So the gas can continue to move back and forwards because of this little residual bit of air that's left in the lungs after you breathe. Even if you breathe out as hard as you possibly can, there's still a little bit of air left in the lungs. Right? Okay, so frequency and depth. When you start to exercise, and one of the first things that happens, we see increases in heart rate, and then we notice our breathing changes, right? So the first thing that happens is that you start to breathe more deeply. So when you first start to exercise, you don't breathe faster, you just start to take slightly deeper breaths, because when you're at rest, you don't fill your whole lung every time you breathe. You only fill a portion of your lung. So you've got this additional space to fill if you need to. Right? Then, if that didn't provide sufficient oxygen for the workload that you are doing, and you're not able to make enough ATP, then your rate of breathing will also increase. So it's the secondary step, but the higher the intensity of exercise, the more important the rate of breathing becomes. So you breathe faster and faster as you work harder and harder. This is annoying, because this is not the right version. What did I do with the other version? Who knows? All right, where are we? Okay, a couple of minutes. All right, so diffusion of the gases then is the key, right? I've got this massive surface area. I've got air coming in that contains oxygen. I want the oxygen at the muscle so I can make ATP aerobically, right? So the things that are going on that benefit that mechanism. So this big surface area, the fact that that respiratory membrane is so narrow. You've only got two cells, one either side of that little gap. The alveolus is only one cell thick, the capillary is only one cell thick. So the membrane is very thin to allow gases to diffuse backwards and forwards. Right? Still though, even with those two variables in place, we still have to have something driving the gas backwards and forwards across the membrane. And the driving force is the pressure difference on either side of the membrane. So, not only do we have high-low between the atmosphere and the lungs, I've also got high-low between the lungs and the bloodstream. Right? So if I want to move oxygen to my bloodstream, right? Then I have to have more oxygen available in the lung tissue than I do in the blood that is being pumped to the lungs from the heart. Because I have to have a pressure gradient one to the other. Yes? Okay? If I want to breathe out carbon dioxide, then I have to have a pressure gradient the other way, has to be higher in the blood, lower in the lungs. Right? And do I have my little diagram? Oh, good. All right. So, here's my version of the pressure gradient. Right? I have a hill. I park my car at the top of the hill. My car is the oxygen. Okay? And it's a steep hill. So, if I take the handbrake off, what happens? Car rolls down the hill, right? So, high to low. Okay? If the pressure gradient, so if my hill is not quite that steep, but I'm still on a hill, it's just not quite as steep as the one before, and I take the handbrake off, what happens?
You graduate fast. You go slowly.
Right? I'm still going to go down the hill, but I'm going to go a little more slowly. So when the pressure gradient, when the difference in pressure is less steep, I can still move gas or blood or air or water or whatever it is. It just doesn't move quite as quickly. Right? What if I'm parked on a flat surface and I take the handbrake off?
It doesn't move fast.
Nothing happens, right? So if there's no pressure gradient, if I don't have a high to low and both sides of the membrane are the same, nothing goes. There has to be a gradient. Alright? Alright, so I know it is a very long time until I see you again. Have a lovely spring break. Stay safe. Try not to completely ignore your ex-phys textbook, even if you only look at it Sunday afternoon when you come back. Okay?